Opposed to these trials have drawn inspiration, encouragement from the problematics of what has been going on here in the trial. What can I say? A lot of very bad people will be very happy if Ivan Demjanjuk is acquitted.
Unfortunately, the Demjanjuk case will always be used as an instrument in the hands of people which were always against trying Nazis everywhere in the world.
But you will have helped them then?
No, I think it's unfair. It's so unfair to suggest it. Who helped them is the prosecution, which, though unprofessionally, decided to prosecute Demjanjuk with such poor evidence, with the risk that the case will collapse, and then they should anticipate that it will be an instrument in the hands of various anti-Semites.
John Demjanjuk waits on death row, impatient for a verdict to clear him. This week, Yoram Sheftel warned the appeal court his client would go on hunger strike unless the decision came quickly.
The material which shows that Demjanjuk is not even deterrable, it's almost 2 years in the courtroom and nothing happens. He is already 6 years in prison, the case is over and there is no verdict. He expects that there will be public attention to the fact that a verdict has not been given in his case.
It may end as the case of Ivan the Less Terrible. A bewildering end for those still haunted by terrible memories which do not lessen as time goes by.
I will always remember what happened to my parents, my sister, to me, and to the Jewish people in the Holocaust. You must understand, the Nazis weren't people, they were animals. But even an animal won't prey on another if it isn't hungry. These people murdered women, children, and old people in cold blood. Why should they not be punished?
Detail of a new strategic arms deal. By the year 2003, the number of nuclear warheads on each side will be down by 2/3 to between 3,000 and 3,500. Land-based missiles with multiple warheads, the Cold War's most dangerous weapon, will have gone completely.
American and Russian officials have been haggling since June over the fine print of the Second Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. In Geneva this morning, the two sides finally reached agreement.
We have made very good progress. We now have, I think, a text that we can put to the two presidents. The final decision will be theirs, and I would hope we would have news for you within the next few days.
The most threatening missiles are land-based with multiple warheads, able to launch a devastating preemptive strike. These are all to be scrapped. Most are Russian. Multi-warhead missiles are also launched from submarines. America has most of those, and they'll be severely reduced in this far-reaching treaty.
The first thing is that it's going to cut the number of nuclear warheads very considerably indeed. START 1 didn't really cut it very much. But it did establish all the base rules, all the counting rules, all the verification rules, which made this particular treaty very much easier to come to an agreement on.
It was in June that America and Russia declared they would make deeper cuts than those in last year's START 1 treaty, but it's taken 6 months to settle the details. Today, America has nearly 10,000 strategic warheads, Russia over 11,000. Under START 1, each side is limited to 6,000 warheads. Now, under START 2, they'll trim to under 3,500 in 10 years' time. But there's a hitch. The Ukrainian parliament hasn't ratified the first treaty and wants $1.5 billion from America to help it scrap its 1,200 warheads. START 2 won't come into effect unless START 1 can be made to work first.
Presidents Bush and Yeltsin are expected to sign the agreement this weekend in Russia. President-elect Bill Clinton said he wasn't worried about it being rushed through before his inauguration on January the 20th. What he knew about the treaty sounded good, he said.
It was the news President Bush had been waiting for, the crowning achievement of his foreign policy initiatives coming in the final days of his term in office. Although out of public view today on a shooting holiday, the president has kept in close phone contact with President Yeltsin in Moscow from his ranch in Texas. The White House said today the two presidents are expected to meet this weekend in a Russian Black Sea resort to sign the agreement. The man who will be taking over at the White House next month, President-elect Bill Clinton, said today he was very pleased with the developments and looked forward to studying the details.
And I think that the quicker we can get these kinds of positive results, the better. So I was fully supportive of making an agreement before I took office, if that could be done. And so based on what I know, I'm encouraged.
Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger arrived back in Washington today. He's scheduled to meet with President Bush tomorrow to discuss the full text of the agreement, an agreement which has been widely welcomed here.
It's fitting 2 weeks from the end of his presidency that he signs the last Cold War agreement. So for a Cold War president to sign the last Cold War agreement has some kind of Shakespearean logic to it.
So last summer's negotiations between America and Russia have finally borne fruit for President Bush in his final days at the White House. David Chater, ITN, in Washington.
Israel today offered to let aid through to its expelled Palestinians if Lebanon would do the same. Lebanon
will meet in the Black Sea resort of Sochi in Russia on January the 2nd and 3rd. The treaty will cut stockpiles of strategic nuclear weapons by 2/3. And in America, a couple who left their...
A third more companies and small businesses
cut the nuclear arsenal of both sides by 2/3. But there are problems. President Yeltsin will find it difficult to steer the treaty through the conservative-dominated Russian parliament.
Yeltsin wouldn't dare to submit this treaty to the Supreme Soviet, that he'd rather wait till April, anticipating some changes in the balance of powers between the Supreme Soviet and the president.
Yeltsin also has a problem with the parliament of the Ukraine, one of 3 former Soviet republics which inherited nuclear weapons. It still hasn't ratified the First START treaty and resents American pressure to sign. President Yeltsin also faces opposition from the Russian military, but he needs to get this treaty signed while he's still powerful enough to push it through. This evening, President Bush is guest of honor at a state banquet in the Kremlin. But outside, ordinary Russians have more pressing concerns.
I don't care about it. The only thing I care about is the price of bread. It is impossible to live.
Tomorrow morning, Presidents Bush and Yeltsin will return to the Kremlin to formally sign the biggest ever arms treaty. Gleno Glaser, ITN, Moscow.
Police arrested more than 300 drink drivers a day over the Christmas period,
which will drastically cut both countries' strategic nuclear weapons.
From the burning sun of Somalia, President Bush flew into the coldest day in Moscow this winter, 20 degrees below zero. But he was guaranteed a warm welcome from Boris Yeltsin. Both men could do with a boost to their morale, Mr. Bush at the end of his term of office and Mr. Yeltsin after a bruising conflict with conservative opponents at home. They'll get that boost from the START II agreement, which will reduce the total number of nuclear warheads owned by Russia and America by 2/3 and eliminate an entire class of the deadliest weapons, land-based missiles with multiple warheads. It's the new spirit of friendship and the end of the Cold War that's made the world safer, not a treaty which, after all, will still leave 6,500 nuclear warheads in place next century. Meeting for a banquet in the Kremlin tonight, Mr. Bush and Mr. Yeltsin put the seal on their new friendship. Tomorrow their talks will cover arms, aid, Russia's reforms and Yugoslavia. But with President Bush on the way out, it's the signing of START II that counts. This is a summit with more symbolism than substance. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
Police in West...
Presidents Bush and Yeltsin before the centerpiece of this, their second and last summit, the official signing of the START II treaty. For George Bush, this moment was the climax of his promise of a new world order, as the two presidents agreed to the destruction of their deadliest first strike nuclear weapons. Afterwards, Boris Yeltsin said Start 2 would become known as the Treaty of Hope, sentiments echoed by President Bush.
We stand together today in this great city at the threshold of a new world of hope, a widening circle of freedom for us and for our children.
Outside in Red Square, anti-Yeltsin demonstrators attacked official cars, but George Bush left Moscow satisfied that in the final major act of his presidency, he has signed the biggest arms treaty ever.
The father of the British charity worker murdered in Somalia says his son knew the dangers but put the job first. Initial reports that Sean Devereux...
Dangerous land-based missiles, those with multiple warheads, will be eliminated. Boris Yeltsin called it an achievement for all mankind. George Bush, on his last foreign trip as president, said it went much further than had been thought possible only a year ago.
It was a treaty of hope, said Mr. Yeltsin, the start of a new era, said Mr. Bush, as they toasted a treaty that will eliminate 2/3 of their nuclear stockpiles over the next 10 years. Mr. Bush waxed lyrical about its significance.
We stand together today in this great city at the threshold of a new world of hope, a widening circle of freedom for us and for our children.
Mr. Yeltsin paid tribute to Mr. Bush's role in ending the Cold War. And in words aimed at hardline opponents who may try to block ratification of the treaty, Mr. Yeltsin stressed that it strengthened Russia's security and wouldn't harm it economically. Earlier, the two presidents had relaxed at a New Year's party in the Kremlin. By the time these children become adults, the world will have consigned 17,000 nuclear warheads to oblivion. The message of Start 2 is that in the post-Cold War era, huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons are not needed for deterrence purposes. That puts pressure on the remaining nuclear powers, Britain, France and China, to join in the disarmament process. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
President Bush left Moscow to fly on to Paris for talks on the Bosnian crisis with his French counterpart, President Mitterrand. President Bush told reporters that America would not support any military action.
John Prodiwas hasn't seen his brother Simon, who's just arrived from the Ukraine, since he fled that country for Britain in 1946. Simon stayed, but the Soviet regime stopped any letters getting through. Last night, they were reunited for the traditional Ukrainian Christmas Eve.
I'm glad he come and see me for such long time, 50 years, long time, for any family to separate, you know.
And those are the headlines now for a look at the region's weather. Mainly dry with sunny intervals and strengthening.
Christmas celebrations are in full swing for the region's Ukrainian community. In Bradford, the home of one of the biggest such communities in Europe, two brothers have been reunited for the first time in nearly 50 years. Damien Johnson joined their family on an emotional Christmas Eve.
Святкує свобідно на Україні новонароджене Боже дитятко, що народилося.
Since fleeing the Ukraine in 1946, John Prodiwas has been separated from his younger brother Simon. The Soviet regime prevented any contact between the two brothers. The collapse of the Soviet Empire has meant they could finally be together again at Christmas.
Because never dream of anything happen like this, never. I'm glad he come and see me for such long time, 50 years, long time, for any family to separate, you know.
Ukrainian Catholics mark Christmas Eve on January the 6th with a 12-course vegetarian meal. Although Simon has travelled thousands of miles to be with his extended family, this Christmas it's felt like home from home.
I'm very happy to be here to meet my brother in a free and democratic England. I'm delighted my brother has brought his sons up in the Ukrainian tradition. I'm just so happy to meet my brother after 50 years.
And a very happy Christmas there to the Ukrainian community. Just look forward to tomorrow night and the prospects on at Look North. We have a full roundup of the sporting action from all of us.
17 nuclear reactors were dumped off the northern coast of Russia. 7 of them contain radioactive fuel. Scientists are worried that fish in the area could become contaminated by radioactivity. This report from Andrew Veach of ITN's Channel 4 News.
2 of the reactors come from this ship, the nuclear icebreaker Lenin. The film is from Russian archives. The midsection of the ship was sunk in the Kara Sea near the island of Novaya Zemlya. Norwegian scientists were told last year that they would be allowed to measure radiation from this and the other wrecks, but the Russian Navy prevented them from getting to the dump site. Today's disclosure by the Russians suggests that some 1.5 tons of uranium laced with plutonium is sitting on the seabed.
In the course of the whole period of usage of atomic energy, 7 reactors have been buried with radioactive waste, and about 10 reactors were unloaded with small levels of radiation.
Each reactor holds some 200 kilos of nuclear fuel. 5 of the reactors come from submarines in the Russian Northern Fleet, based here in Murmansk and along the coast at Severodvinsk. Tests in the Barents Sea suggest that radioactive material has yet to leak from the reactors. Norwegian scientists are urging the Russians to tackle the problem now, before the metal containing the fuel rods rusts away. The fear is that currents will wash uranium and plutonium into Norwegian fishing grounds and out into the North Sea. The disclosure came at the end of an International Atomic Energy Agency meeting in Oslo. British officials say they're still studying the implications. The wrecks are dumped in the shallow bays of Novaya Zemlya, spawning grounds for fish. The concern is that contaminated fish could reach the markets, and no one knows for certain how to make the wrecks safe.
Chris Patton, the governor of Hong Kong, left hospital today.
Agreement on nuclear weapons, and he wants his country to become a non-nuclear state. Mr. Kravchuk represents a country stretching from Belarusia to the Black Sea with a population of 52 million people. It's an important agricultural producer with huge resources of coal and other minerals. Ukraine has its own currency, the hryvnia, and its own armed forces. More than 170 strategic nuclear missiles are still on Ukrainian soil, for the moment effectively controlled by neighboring Russia.
Mr. Kravchuk is a former Communist Party boss who jumped on the bandwagon of Ukrainian nationalism and is now trying to forge closer ties with the West. He's come looking for economic aid and investment and signed cooperation agreements with the Prime Minister. But the British government has a different agenda. It's making demands on Ukraine to give up its nuclear missiles and to tighten up on sanctions against Serbia. Ukraine's nuclear weaponry was left over from the old Soviet Union. There are hardline voices in Ukraine which, worried about the Russian neighbor, say that Ukraine should keep them. The nuclear powers are ready to give admittedly standard assurances that Ukraine would not be targeted by nuclear weapons. The official Ukrainian line is that they will go, but there's a price: better security guarantees and cash compensation.
The Ukrainians are anxious, on the nuclear side at least, to defer any concessions that they make as long as possible so that they can extract the maximum in resources and commitments from the West.
Mr. Kravchuk, in an interview for BBC Newsnight tonight, gave an assurance that nuclear disarmament was on the way, with the START 1 treaty up for ratification.
Я сподіваюся, що парламент ратифікує.
I hope Parliament will ratify it, but following ratification there'll be complex problems. The problem of destroying the weapons and a whole range of financial, ecological and legal problems.
Екологічних, правових проблем.
The other British demand is for Ukraine to ensure that Serbian oil barges, which have run past sanctions monitors on the River Danube, are stopped from loading in Ukrainian waters. Assurances have been given for the future, though no blame accepted for the past.
Але вони не українські. Це раз. Нафта не українська.
These barges are not Ukrainian, that's the first point, and the oil is not Ukrainian, and the consignments were shipped with the right documents.
Mr. Kravchuk also went to the European Development Bank. It's displeased with the slow progress he's made towards economic reform. He's not too pleased with the slow process of getting Western aid. Mr. Kravchuk has been welcomed with plenty of outward show, but the days have long gone when the leaders of former communist republics are welcome for their own sakes. And the harsh message to Mr. Kravchuk is that if Ukraine wants to be part of the West, it'll have to play by Western rules.
The Queen has presented the BBC Television's chief news correspondent, Kate Adie.
Today, the first visit by a leader of the country which ranks second only to Russia in Eastern Europe. Mr. Major was seeking assurances on nuclear weapons, economic issues and sanctions against Serbia. Mark Urban reports on how the Ukrainian president plans to prevent nationalism and economic tensions from spreading instability in Eastern Europe.
Plunging into the heart of capitalism in the city today, President Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine had come to argue for his slice of a small financial cake. Jacques Attali, head of the European Reconstruction and Development Bank, heard the president's arguments that the Ukrainian economy deserved much more Western help. In a Newsnight interview tonight, President Kravchuk warned of the possible consequences if there wasn't more aid.
But the situation in Ukraine today, and not only in Ukraine, is such that it will be difficult to solve this problem without aid. I hope that Europe is interested in Ukraine being democratic, peaceful, civilized, lawful and open, and in Ukraine playing a stabilizing role in Europe, and not only in Europe. I think Europe is interested in this. And so I hope it will give us appropriate aid.
The introduction 1 year ago of coupons as the first step to a separate national currency has created major problems. Today they've lost half their value against the Russian ruble, about as unenviable a position as any currency could be in. Trade with Russia has always been vital. Ukraine, the breadbasket, giving the former Soviet Union a quarter of its food. Russia gave the Ukraine 90% of the diesel and petrol needed to drive its economy. Now nationalism divides them. Many Russians believe their country should reclaim the Crimea, territory ceded to Ukraine just after the war. More extreme nationalists believe extensive areas of Russian settlement dating from the early 19th century, the so-called New Russia, should also belong to Moscow. The fate of 11 million Russian Ukrainians could become a cause for conflict if extreme nationalists gain greater power.
If Russia is a threat, then it's not only a threat to Ukraine. If Russia becomes a threat, and in principle this could happen with any state if chauvinists and nationalist patriots gain the upper hand, and if in this state there is a departure from the democratic process to other methods, then this is not only a threat to Ukraine, this is a threat for the whole of Europe. I would like everyone to understand this.
You've mentioned national chauvinism in a Russian context, but clearly there are extreme nationalists in the Ukraine as well. How far do you accept that you yourself have exploited nationalist feeling in these political conflicts with Russia?
I do not support nationalist movements. I support the national idea, and one cannot compare it with nationalist problems. That is important for me. Therefore, we exploit national forces, which are directed at progress, at the building of democracy. But we do not exploit nationalist forces, and will not exploit them.
The Soviet collapse has left Ukraine with more than 170 ballistic missiles. The country has a nuclear weapons stockpile about 5 times the size of Britain's. Ukraine's nuclear arsenal has been signed away by Moscow in the START I treaty. Last month, Presidents Bush and Yeltsin agreed START II, but Ukraine still hasn't ratified START I. The reductions have also become hostage to nationalist rivalries. Britain and other Western powers are pressing President Kravchuk to ratify. In principle, he agrees, but in practice, he's still bargaining.
I hope that Parliament will ratify it, but after ratification there will be very complex problems. the destruction of nuclear weapons. We'll need to solve a whole range of financial, organizational problems, scientific, legal problems. We'll have to do all this following ratification. We spoke about this with Prime Minister John Major and Jacques Attali.
You've said in the past that one of the reasons you haven't ratified the treaty yet is because you want guarantees for your country's security. Where exactly do you see the threat emanating from?
Бачите, загроза може виникнути в будь-якій.
The threat could arise in any situation, and not only from one side. The world is unstable. There are complex processes going on in Yugoslavia, and there are problems. And blood is being shed in the territory of the former Soviet Union. We should take all this into account. Ukraine, which has nuclear weapons on its soil and is the third largest nuclear power in the world, agrees to destroy them. Our people have grounds for appropriate concerns. This is why we are saying that we are doing this, and we will do this, but we need the relevant guarantees.
When the Prime Minister met President Kravchuk this afternoon, there was one more vital item on the agenda: maintaining UN sanctions against Serbia. Oil bound for Serbia has made its way through a Ukrainian port recently. President Kravchuk blames customs chaos in the former Soviet Union.
Але вони не українські. Це раз.
Firstly, they are not Ukrainian. Secondly, the oil is not Ukrainian. And thirdly, the consignments had the relevant documents. The customs checked the documents, but not the oil. And everything was in order with the documents, and we showed them to UN experts. Ukraine is not directly to blame, although we have drawn the relevant conclusions and will increase control to stop this from happening. But control should be intensified on the part of other states, including Romania and Bulgaria, through which these barges and ships pass.
Imagine an illness which comes from nowhere, strikes at children without warning, and causes cancers, kidney problem, drugs, or proper treatment. Tonight, World in Action visits such a place and counts the cost of the world's greatest man-made tragedy. These are the children of Chernobyl, their lives blighted by the nuclear disaster 7 years ago. Now they face a new catastrophe. The breakup of the Soviet Union has left them victims of corruption and chaos.
Ukraine right now is in a very, very serious economic crisis. It is starting life after a year and a half of independence, completely devoid, virtually devoid of foreign currency or other assets with which, for example, it can buy medical supplies, which are in very, very urgent need right now.
One town in the Ukraine, Chernigov, has 50,000 sick children as a result of Chernobyl. Their number is increasing each year, but in the last few months, basic medicines have become almost unavailable.
Ни одна семья, ни я, ни мои товарищи по работе, ни мои соседи не имеют гарантии, что в их семьи ворвется горе в виде лейкемии или рака щитовидной железы у ребенка и так далее. Мы, к большому сожалению, сейчас чувствуем, что в мире несколько забыли об аварии.
Chernigov is the Ukraine's second largest city. Once a popular holiday resort, it's the birthplace of Nina Bogdanova.
It was a very beautiful town, healthy air, beautiful rivers, forests. I used to pick mushrooms, berries in the forest. People used to come here because of beautiful, healthy waters in my beautiful river Desna and fresh air, which was very, very healthy.
26 years ago, she left the Soviet Union. She married an Englishman and settled in Lancashire. Despite harsh restrictions imposed by the communist authorities, Nina Rogerson has returned each year to see the family she left behind. But since the breakup of the Soviet Union, she's become distressed to see the rapid decline in the Ukraine's economy.
I sure it is worse, much, much worse. My country is just go to pieces, I think, my own opinion. And my people are hungry because food is too expensive. There's no medicine, there's corruption, and poor people and children suffering most.
Was the accident at Chernobyl, was that a major turning point?
Of course it is, of course it is. I'm absolutely sure that all these children suffering, mostly children, touch my heart. It is direct result of Chernobyl, yes, disaster, yes, I do.
7 years ago this month, scientists at the Chernobyl nuclear power station mismanaged a safety test. As a result, they accidentally blew up the plant's number 4 reactor. At 1 o'clock in the morning of the 26th of April 1986, lethal radioactive material exploded from the reactor's core. The wind scattered deadly elements like cesium, plutonium, and strontium across Europe. The people most at risk lived in the workers' town of Pripyat. It's just a mile from the reactor. But the residents here were not told the full horror of the accident for another 24 hours.
The population of Pripyat was evacuated on the 27th of April, and it was necessary for 3 hours to evacuate all the people. There were about 60,000 people there, and about 1,000 buses came to Pripyat to take off the people. First of all, they were evacuated to Kiev and so small cities which were situated near Kiev.
7 years later, and Pripyat is still deserted. No one has ever been allowed home.
Today's Pripyat is the dead city, and it is very sad, but it's the fact that it is the dead city. We may see the stadium here, which was never used. We may see the children, kindergartens, children's places where the children never played.
The 6 miles that surround Chernobyl are the most contaminated in the world. They are a poisoned and desolate wasteland.
There are a lot of places which were very dirty. It is the high radiation levels, and the situation is very bad. "40
miles east of Chernobyl is Nina Rogerson's hometown of Chernigov. At first, its people thought radioactive fallout from the reactor had passed them by because the wind blew to the north. Life in the town went on as usual. Then disaster. The wind changed direction and blew instead towards Chernigov.
И именно в эти дни произошел большой выброс радиоактивного йода на территорию нашей области, связанный с аварией на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции. Мы также обнаруживаем у нас в области и другие радиоактивные элементы, такие как стронций, цезий, уран и другие. Пагубное влияние которых также сказывается на населении.
In Chernigov Cemetery are graves of some of the liquidators, men who helped clear out radioactive debris at the reactor. Here, too, are children who died after the accident. It's a tragic corner, but it doesn't tell the full story. More than 50,000 children in Chernigov, 5 out of 6, are ill because of Chernobyl.
Схудала немножко за это время. Кроме гриппа ничего за этот год не было?
9-year-old Yura is suffering from thyroid cancer. Until Chernobyl, this clinic had not treated such a disease for 30 years. Now, it's just one of a growing number of radiation-related illnesses.
Кроме того, мы видим, что дети стали чаще болеть, более длительно болеть, что иммунитет снизился.
Official figures reveal that 2,500 Chernigov children suffer blood diseases, 4 times more than in 1986. Nearly 7,000 have severe stomach complications, 10 times the total before Chernobyl. And a massive 44,500 have thyroid gland problems. Dr. Natalie Leonidovna is a specialist at the town's number 2 clinic. Today, she's visiting 2 of the clinic's patients who are most affected by Chernobyl. Her first call is to 4-year-old Katya Kosakevich.
Катя родилась в семье, где до этого родилось 3 здоровых детей. Родители Кати здоровы. Катя родилась в 1988 году после аварии. Родилась недоношенной, с параличами нижних конечностей. Ты хочешь научиться ходить, играть с детками на улице? Хочешь? Ты стараешься? Помогаешь маме?
Да, голова думает, а ноги не идут. Просто наркоза не вынесет.
As well as being paralyzed, Katya also suffers from mental problems. The government gives the family a small grant to compensate for Chernobyl, but they cannot even afford any special walking equipment.
Катюша, тебе нравятся уколы, нет?
And there's an even more serious problem. Katya is waiting for one critical drug, but such drugs are unavailable.
Любовь Федоровна, нужно еще один курс медикаментозного лечения провести. К сожалению, у нас сейчас нет гамалона, мы много лет уже не получаем его.
Dr. Leonidovna's next case is 5-year-old Natasha Prochorenko.
Отец Наташи был связан с ликвидацией последствий аварии на Чернобыльской станции. Мама медсестра. Родители здоровы, наследственных заболеваний в семье нет. Наташа родилась с врожденным раком почки и с деформацией туловища.
И пошла к хирургу и подтвердилось, что это действительно опухоль. Сразу он так хотел мне немножко пощадить, говорит, не расстраивайся, может там еще и не это. Но сам был уверен, я уже знала, что это. И когда он нам сказал, что у нас уже это опухоль, муж взял коляску и пошел с ней. Да, я уже не могла идти.
Вы попали в руки к хорошему хирургу.
Natasha's tummy is heavily scarred, and one leg is shorter than the other.
Во-вторых, она же и танцевать хочет, и просится в бассейн, и на пляж. Мы даже идем на пляж, как пришла к нам одна врачиха, я говорит, как же ты будешь ходить на пляж? Вот действительно, мы идем с детьми на пляж, рядом же Десна у нас, и прямо на речке. Так сейчас она этого еще не понимает, а через год она же будет понимать, она будет стесняться и раздеться, и все. Я уже не могу смотреть на ножку.
вкусный.
Three of Nina Rogerson's family have also suffered because of Chernobyl. Worst affected is her 6-year-old great niece, Anya.
Почему ты кашляешь? Не знаешь, почему ты кашляешь? Всегда то болит, то тебя болит. Little Anya was born 2 weeks before Chernobyl accident happened. Во дворе? А во дворе каток есть, да? She's constantly ill. Child picked up any infection which around, and she very anemic, and she looked very pale. She had it always blue into her eyes, and very restless, very restless.
After seeing the lack of medical supplies in her hometown, Nina Rogerson resolved to do something about the suffering. Last November, she brought 2 lorry loads of medical aid from England. She delivered the most basic of supplies like vitamins, bandages and syringes to the regional children's hospital in Chernigov, where her great-niece Anya is treated. The hospital once boasted a proud reputation and plenty of resources. Today, it's quite different. The wards designed for 300 children are crowded with more than double that number. There's an even greater problem, an acute shortage of drugs, including antibiotics, hormones and insulin. The hospital is run by Alexander Koreta.
Дело в том, что в последнее время, особенно в 92-93 году, резко обострилась ситуация с нехваткой в критической ситуации, и не сможем оказать ребенку из-за полного отсутствия перечисленных мною медикаментов медицинскую необходимую помощь.
There are major difficulties too in the operating theatre. 4-year-old Yana Mirozhnik is suffering from kidney cancer. Surgeons have to remove a large malignant tumor. Before Chernobyl, this hospital saw only 1 or 2 such cases a year. Last year, there were 14. Not only has the number of cases risen, but a surgeon like Anatoly Shish has to perform life-saving operations in crude surroundings with old-fashioned equipment.
Очень много проблем. И перевязочный материал, и шовный материал, и инструментарий хирургический. У нас скальпелей нет, это все старое, уже она приходит в негодность. Вот. И кроме того, диагностической аппаратуры у нас очень мало. И, конечно, нуждаемся, во многом нуждаемся. В том числе и в химиопрепаратах. Вот нужно проводить химиотерапию, специальные есть вещества, их у нас также мало. Некоторых вообще нет.
But the real horrors of Chernobyl's legacy are to be found 100 miles away at an orphanage for children from the Chernigov region. The scenes are so distressing that the authorities try to stop World in Action from coming here. Many of the 150 children are disabled. Most are bedridden and have short life expectancy. Dr. Olga Nikolaevna told us that here too, Chernobyl has left its mark.
Вот Гриша, явный свидетель, сидит, нас слушает. Значит, этот Гришенька, который имеется без сомнения и психическая патология, но он же физический инвалид. Вы же видите, мы ему не можем ничего, потому что нету рук, нету ног.
The shortage of drugs and medicines in Chernigov is bad, but at the Prelyuki orphanage, it's critical.
Я бы сказала, что если у нас с питанием еще нас государство опекает и не обижает, все оно отдает, что может, чтобы эти дети были накормлены, не голодные, одеты, как видите, у них чистые постельки, все, то с медикаментами у нас катастрофическое положение. Это можно с уверенностью сказать. Не то слово плохо, а катастрофа.
The health crisis can be traced to the breakup of the Soviet Union and Ukraine's so far disastrous attempts to introduce capitalism. The economy shrank by 20% last year. Essentials like bread and milk are expensive, and corruption is widespread. Simple drugs like aspirin, if found at all, can cost a week's wages. Inflation is running at 2,500%, and Ukraine's currency is worthless.
The country needs, for 1993, $800 million for medical supplies. Now, by international standards, that is not a very large amount, but I know that it's something which the country simply cannot afford.
For ordinary people, the shortage of drugs is critical. But for those with money, especially dollars, it is possible to buy drugs on the black market. In this Kiev market, it took just a few minutes for us to find the supplies that hospitals need so badly. Baby food, non-existent in most hospitals, is on sale for 1,300 Ukrainian coupons per tin, almost a week's wages. World in Action was offered 80 more tins at the same inflated prices. Imported from Ireland, France and Holland, they are marked property of the Health Ministry. Corruption feeds the black market, which in turn exploits desperate parents who feel that their sick children must come first. For this mother, the results were disastrous.
После того, как заболел малыш, конечно, пришлось абсолютно продавать все, что у нас было. Это, в общем-то, там машину, гараж, да. В общем-то, все ценные вещи, все там драгоценные, то, что, в общем-то, мне там осталось все наследство от бабушек, от дедушек, да, вот все это, собственно, пришлось продать, потому что все только уходило все на препараты.
Чтобы спасти ребенка, чтобы
да, потому что выхода другого практически не было, собственно, было.
Meanwhile, there is still the ultimate nightmare, another nuclear disaster. Remarkably, although the damaged reactor is sealed, the rest of the plant is still open, and it's dangerous. A fire in 1991 closed another reactor at the plant. This year, there have been 2 more fires.
The scientists and the specialists say that the fourth reactor, it is not very safety. There are a lot of holes in the sarcophagus, more than 1,000 square meters of these holes, which are in the roof. And the snow and the sun and the rain which drops through these holes, and there is some destruction places which are taking place there. And that is why the scientists must do something with it for future.
But hazardous or not, the Ukrainian government cannot afford to shut Chernobyl. Nuclear power provides a third of the country's electricity. Today, 2 of its 4 reactors still operate.
The other 2 continue to pose very serious safety concerns. The government has undertaken to have them closed down by the end of 1993, but they're still running. They therefore pose a serious potential risk. And of course, so do the others, which are built to the same design in other parts of Ukraine.
2 years ago, the United Nations asked the world to help solve the health and environmental problems caused by Chernobyl. It appealed for $650 million. To date, it has raised only $1 million.
There are a number of reasons for that. Regrettable amount of indifference by the international community. You don't see people dying of it, even though the number of victims has been estimated up to 8,000. And the number of people affected was over 3 million, probably. Also, nuclear accidents do not evoke the same sort of response as the more direct and the more visible and the more dramatic humanitarian crises which the world has seen.
On her last day in Chernigov, Nina Rogerson attends Sunday morning service at one of the town's old Russian Orthodox churches. As a child, she came here secretly to pray, despite the communist authorities.
It was prohibited to go to church, especially when you're at school. So we went secretly, like holidays, religious holidays like Easter, Christmas.
For her, this latest visit to Chernigov has been her most traumatic.
My country is just go to pieces. There's no medicine, and poor people and children suffering most without food. Children, babies, and elderly people.
Nina Rogerson has returned to England. She aims to come back to Chernigov in the summer with more aid for the children of her hometown.
Most vivid memory, it was a child in children's orphanage in Perluki, little Grisha. It touched my heart. Yes, I was very upset to see him.
Don't be silly.
Me, silly?
Change at the top. The position at the halfway stage. Belenki leading Korobczynski. Gehrman having a bit to say, with Khan and Karbanenko in the top 5. Igor Korobczynski coming to a piece of apparatus on which he can perform quite superbly.
Multiple circles on one handle. During travelling with spindles, complex, and well up with the difficulty requirements. We break now into the flare skills. The dismount sequence that cost him once, but not this time. He needed that performance.
Full flowing Korobczynski. Not too many smiles from him, though. The Russian wanting a...
High in the inverted cross. Now, he won't get credit for that. They're after the difficult combinations, and he bent his arms badly. A lack of concentration, and he won't be pleased with this routine.
Started better than Belenki. His first piece of apparatus produced a 9.5. But he's gone back since.
Double pike front somersault, the unison between the rings to handstand. But struggled to keep them under control. If he could hold that position, he'd get bonus.
Valery Belenki comes to the 9.05 for rings. First position, it says, but that doesn't take into account Belenki's score yet. Ends his qualifying competition on the vault.
The handspring double front, and he comes to grief.
Came on the horse rather high. Couldn't really convert the fight upwards to give himself enough room to rotate twice.
8.925 is the score for Korobczynski. So Valery Belenki winning this particular group, the gymnasts in the third round of the qualifying competition. So we're at the halfway point. Belenki, Liukin, Korobczynski, the top three, with Karbanenko going above the younger Russian, Alexei Nemov, who may well not be in the all-round competition because Sergei Harkov still has to come for Russia, and only the top two from each country are allowed to compete. But a mass of former Soviet Union athletes at the head of affairs at the moment. It's likely to stay that way.
Let me get you up.
Stoichaya of the Ukraine.
Interesting double back pike. She's away. Lovely light and graceful touches in the links. Two and a half twists into a fly spring. The all-important final impression for the judges, the last tumble. And it's a triple twist. Just a pace at the end of the triple twist. She tumbled well.
Started competently with a 9.6 on the beam.
The round off. 2.5 twists and the fly spring from it.
$9.775, a higher score. A position, of course, as well other gymnasts still have to compete, but even so. Now, Tatiana Lysenko started with 9.712 on the beam. That put her in 6th place at the end of the first rotation. She looked generously marked during the qualifying competition when she wasn't really tight in her performances. But that opening score's given her a chance, and she likes the floor, and the floor likes her.
Double front from a half turn, known as an Arabian somersault. Great start. And she moves so well. Beautiful posture. Lovely connection. Those leaps are important in the overall impression the judges gain of the exercise. Two and a half twists and a punch front somersault, just a little falter there to the right. Confident in all of the dancing elements. spring, the full twisting front. Lovely presentation. Some good tumbling and some very elegant linking.
But a telling red flag, Rich.
And that red flag in one of her most ambitious tumbles signified that she took a foot out of the floor area.
Stopping to have a conversation with Dmitry Bilozetchev, twice world champion.